immortal earth is more than just land, it is the memory of ancient heroes. And the terrors that awoke with the first light of dawn today, an old wizard will tell you yet another legend, so you may understand that even the darkest times can give birth to light in the twilight years of the Third Age, when the shadows in the east began once more to stir, and the White Council grew wary of whispers on the wind. A subtle unease crept into the lands of the west. The world was changing, though few yet knew its strange clouds gathered over the vale of Nankuranir, and cold rains fell even in midsummer. The birds avoided the high black tower of Orthanc, and beasts that once roamed freely near the river e'en grew silent. Orthanc, the stone fang of Isengard, had long stood untouched by time, its walls unbroken since the days of the new Manorins. And in its highest chamber dwelt one of the wise, the white wizards, Saruman, head, the Istali, keeper of knowledge and secrets. Once he had walked among the free peoples with wisdom in his eyes, counsel on his tongue, but now doors were shut, messages went unanswered, and none were welcome behind the ringed walls of Isengard. Word of these changes reached the ears of Gandalf the Grey, who more than any other sensed a trembling beneath the surface of peace. And so quietly he summoned a young ranger from the north, a keen-eyed youth named Colin, son of Marin, whose feet had tread the wild paths from the grey flood to the borders of Roha. "You have sharp ears and a quiet step," Gandalf had said, leaning on his staff beneath the swaying trees of Holland. "And more importantly, Saruman does not know your face, I fear. He delves into matters best left untouched. I would have you go to Isengard as a messenger, bear this token, and offer the tale I told you, gain entrance, and watch, learn what you may. But be wary, Callan, for I do not know what you will find thus cloaked in a traveler's garb." And bearing a sealed scroll, Callan rode south. The path was long, and the journey cold, for strange mists clung to the road, and bird song vanished with the turning of each mile. On the third day, he glimpsed the ring of Isengard, an ancient circle of stone, blackened with age, set like a crown around the tower of Orthanc. The gates stood tall, iron and shut, and no guard stood. What he rode forward regardless, the token of Gandalf pressed to his palm. His horse stamped uneasily. Then the gates creaked slow and heavy, and a voice called out, not from behind the gate, but above, high above, near the tower's peak, where windows gleamed like eyes. "Who comes to Isengard unbidden?" it asked. Callan raised his voice, "A messenger from Mithrand. He bids me bring word to the Lord of the Tower." There was silence, save the wind's whisper. Then, with a deep groan of stone and chain, the gates of Isengard opened. Callan urged his horse forward, heart steady, despite the weight of the tower's gaze upon him. The courtyard was empty. Grass grew in cracked patterns, and dark stains marred the flagstones. At last, he came to the foot of Orthanc itself, and there a man awaited, clad in grey robes, face pale and sharp, with hair the color of moonlight. But it was not Saruman. "I am Elberyn," the man said. "Attendant to the white wizard, you shall be brought before him shortly. Come, leave your horse. None may ride within." Callan obeyed, though he felt the press of many watching eyes. Though he saw none, he followed Elberyn through narrow doors and into the tower's belly. The passageways wound in dizzying spirals, and the stone was cold and smooth, lit by pale blue lanterns, whose flame did not flicker. At last, they came to a wide chamber high in the tower, lined with tomes and shelves and scrolls beyond counting. And in its center stood Saruman. He was taller than Callan had expected, and his presence filled the room like thunder in a still sky. His robes were white as bone, yet shimmered with glints of other hues, faint and fleeting like oil on water. His beard flowed like a river of snow, and his eyes were cold stars, far away and knowing. "Well," Saruman said, voice deep and carved from stone, "myth reindeer sends a boy to do a wizard's work." "What word from the grey wanderer?" Kaelin bowed, offering the scroll with both hands. He sends greetings and speaks of unrest in the east. He seeks counsel with the White Council. Should the time prove dark enough, Saruman took the scroll, but did not open it. He studied Kaelin instead. Write your tongue is honest, but your presence curious. What does Gandalf suspect? I wonder. I do not know, my lord, Kaelin said. Indeed, Saruman murmured, turning away. Then you shall stay a while in Orthanc. It may be that Mithrandia sends you not only to deliver, but observe. A flicker of amusement passed over his face, but it was gone in an instant. He raised a hand and gestured toward a side door. Alberin will see you to your quarters. You will be permitted to walk the lower halls, but not the forges, nor the tower's crown. Speak to none without leave. Do not wander. Kaelin inclined his head and turned to go, his heart heavy with unease. As he left the chamber, he could feel Saruman's gaze upon him, still sharp as a blade drawn in silence. And so the ranger became a guest in a tower filled with shadows. Each day he walked the halls, noting what he could. Strange engines were behind locked doors. Pipes ran through the walls like veins, and from below came the sound of hammers striking metal. The ground, he noticed, trembled at times, barely perceptible, like the pulse of something vast. And hidden he saw no other guests, only servants, in gray eyes dull, moving like sleepwalkers. One night, long past the hour of rest, Kaelin crept from his chamber. The tower hummed faintly. He followed the sound, descending deeper into Orthanc, until he found a door half open, and beyond it, a room that flickered with firelight. His footsteps echoing quietly, and then quiet as a leaf on the breeze. Within was a forge unlike any he had seen. No ordinary coals burned there, but a pale green flame that danced without smoke, and above it hung a crystal large as a man's head, suspended in a cage of blackened steel. Light pulsed within it, rhythmic and unnatural, like a heartbeat of star. On a nearby table lay parchments, covered runes he could not read, and diagrams of something large, something shaped like a man, but armored and hollow. Then, from the far end of the forge, a shape moved. Kaelin ducked behind a pillar. Heart pounding, a figure emerged, tall, robed in white, yet now with hands blackened from soot and sleeves scorched by heat. Saruman, the white wizard, approached the crystal and laid a hand upon its cage. It is nearly ready, he said, voice low, as if speaking to someone unseen. The fume shall rise, and the world will behold a new order, born not of elven art or dwarven craft, but of reason, of will. Behind him, something stirred in the shadows, a shiver of chains, a groan, and the faintest whisper. No more. Kaelin's breath caught in his throat. He was not alone in that forge. Something else was imprisoned there. And so the secret was no longer sealed. The game had begun. Kaelin backed away from the chamber, as silently as he could, his breath shallow. In his chest, the faint moaning sound still echoed faintly from within, too soft to be fully human, too broken to be anything else. Something or someone was chained inside that forge, twisted and forgotten in Saruman's secret work. The firelight glimmered on the smooth obsidian walls, throwing his shadow in long strokes behind him as he turned and began the slow climb back toward his quarters. He passed no one in the halls, yet the silence felt heavy, as if the tower itself were watching him. When he reached his chamber, he bolted the door and leaned against it, hands shaking. Saruman had spoken of a name, Thalmec, a thing not born of flesh or magic, but will and artifice. The name alone chilled him, though he could not yet say why that night's sleep did not come easily. And when it did, it brought with it images of hollow men with fire behind their eyes and voices that called from beneath the floor. The following morning, Kaelin resumed his careful facade. He wandered the permitted halls, took his meals in silence, and studied the faces of the silent attendants with growing unease. Their eyes were always the same, dull, glassy, and blank as river stones. He tried once to speak with one, a boy not much older than himself, boy simply stared past him unmoving, until Elberin appeared from a nearby stairwell and quietly guided Kaelin away without a word of reprimand or explanation. Each hour he spent in the tower only deepened his suspicion that Saruman had long since crossed some hidden threshold, one that the other wizards, perhaps even wise, had failed to see. Gandalf's fears were not unfounded. Orthanc was no longer a place of learning or law, but a machine vast and faceless, hidden beneath layers of stone and spell. On the third night, Kaelin returned to the forge. This time he moved with even greater care, winding his way through the servant corridors, slipping past unused storerooms and maintenance chambers, until the strange green glow beckoned him once more. He waited a long time before entering, crouched behind the half-closed door, watching. Saruman stood again at the center, his arms raised toward the caged crystal. Sparks fled around it like stars caught in a storm, and the flame beneath had deepened to a sickly emerald hue around him. Mechanisms whirred and clicked, armatures, lenses, and copper coils etched with runes that Kaelin could not decipher. But it was not Saruman who caught his eye this time. To the left of the forge, chained to a great slab of blackened iron, crouched a figure. It was humanoid in shape, but its body was misshapen, limbs slightly too long, skin mottled, and pale tufts of hair still clung to its head. And its eyes, when they flicked open, were a dark, watery blue, filled with a sorrow that pierced Kaelin to the core. This was no mindless creature. This was a man, or had once been. Saruman turned toward it and lifted a small glass vial filled with a silver liquid that shimmered unnaturally in the torchlight. "You see," he said, speaking not to the creature, but to the air itself, perhaps to some presence unseen. "The base design fails, yes, but it gives insight. Each failure is a lesson. The next will stand. The th mark will not falter, for I will purge it of weakness." The chained figure groaned, then spoke barely a whisper. "Please, no more." Saruman did not respond. He poured the contents of the vial into a channel set in the floor. The moment the liquid touched the forge's base, the flame flared brighter, and the crystal pulsed like a living heart. Runes along the walls flared briefly, then dimmed again, as if the tower itself had drawn a breath. Kaelin watched, frozen in place. He could feel something building in the air, some force gathering with every moment. The ritual continued. He did not know what the thorac truly was, but he was certain now that it could not be allowed to rise. This was no mere machine. It was a weapon forged in secret, meant to bend the future of Middle-earth to Saruman's. Well, he turned to go, already planning his next move. But as he slipped back through the corridor, his foot brushed against a loose stone, and it clattered across the floor. The sound echoed like a crack of thunder. At once, Saddleman turned. "Who is there?" Kaelin fled, heart racing, feet barely touching the ground. The tower's corridors blurred past him as he ran, weaving through side paths and stairwells, until at last he reached the servant quarters and ducked into a shadowed alcove. There he waited, silent and still as hurried footsteps passed nearby. No alarm was raised, and he dared not move until well after the tower had gone quiet once more. He returned to his chamber just before dawn, soaked with sweat and dread. His presence had nearly been discovered, and he could not count on such luck again. The time had come to act. The next day, Kaelin left his room early and made his way toward the outer courtyard, pretending to admire the tower's architecture. What he truly sought was a path, a hidden door, a forgotten stairwell, some way to reach the lower levels unnoticed. His eyes scanned every wall, every groove in the stone, every shadow, and at last he found it. Near the old well at the edge of the grounds stood a narrow archway, half covered by ivy. Behind it, a stairwell wound down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and damp, and bore the faintest scent of iron and smoke. That night Kaelin returned bearing a torch and a dagger. He wrapped the flame in cloth to hide its light, then crept through the archway and descended the stair, spiraled downward narrower. And older than the rest of Orthanc's halls its stone was rough-hewn, and strange markings lined the walls, ancient faded things, as if the passage had not been made by Saruman, but discovered and repurposed at the base. He found a low tunnel that led into the foundations of the tower. Here the hum of machinery was louder, and the air shimmered faintly with heat. He moved swiftly and quietly, keeping to the shadows, through a grated passage. He saw another chamber larger than the forge above, filled with strange devices. Great vats bubbled with glowing liquid, and iron coffins lined the walls. Each bore a rune at its head, and some stirred faintly, as if the things within had not yet died, or worse, had never truly lived. Kaelin withdrew, bile rising in his throat. Saruman was building not one thalmage, but many. Suddenly, he heard a sound, a faint, rattling breath. He turned and found himself face to face with the chained figure from the forge. It had been moved, or perhaps there was more than one. The creature's face twitched, its lips moved, and in a hoarse whisper, it spoke help. Kaelin stared, his hand tightening on the dagger, but the creature did not lunge or threaten. It simply knelt there, chained and broken, its eyes full of pleading. I remember the forest trees, light name. Ellen, dear. Kaelin stepped closer. You were a man, yes, ranger, like you. Something within Kaelin hardened. Whatever Saruman had done, he had taken this man's body, twisted it in pursuit of his alchemy, and cast him aside like failed parchment. I'll come back, Kaelin whispered. I'll free you, I swear it. The creature's head sagged in weak gratitude, but Kaelin knew now the truth. Saruman was building an army not of orcs or men, but forged from suffering and stolen life. And if he did not stop it, none would. Kaelin returned to his chamber before the bell tolled the morning hour. But his thoughts stayed far beneath the tower, among the broken machines and the quiet, haunted voice of Alandir. He paced the narrow floor as the first light crept through the high slotted window, his mind racing through questions and half-formed plans. Saruman had gone far beyond what the White Council could have imagined. The Thorac was not a single creation, but a terrible craft, a twisted alchemy that blended metal magic and the stolen essence of men. He could not wait any longer. His mission had changed. He must send word to Gandalf somehow, before Saruman completed whatever ritual he was preparing. Yet no ravens flew from Orthanc, and no messenger left its gates. Calm was effectively sealed in a cage of stone and secrecy, surrounded by mindless servants and veiled eyes. The thought chilled him, but he would not be deterred. At midday, Elberyn summoned him once more to the high chamber of Saruman. The wizard stood at the center of the circular room, the palantir draped in black cloth upon its pedestal, and his long hands clasped behind his back. His robes, though still white, bore new streaks of gray ash and the faint scent of fire. You have been quiet, young ranger, Saruman said, his tone mild but distant. You do not ask questions. You do not offer much talk. Why is that? Kaelin bowed his head, slightly careful to meet Saruman's gaze, only for a moment. I was told to observe, not to speak. I thought it wise to obey. Saruman gave a faint smile, but it was as cold as the stone beneath their feet. Wise indeed. But tell me, what have you observed? The question carried weight, and Kaelin knew that the wizard was testing him. He thought carefully before answering that Orthanc is no longer what it once was. It has changed, grown quieter, more focused. I see no law masters, no scholars, only purpose. There was a pause, and then a slow nod from Saruman. Purpose is a kind of clarity. A tower without purpose is a tomb of dust. You may not understand it now, but in time you might. The world is shifting, Kaelin. The old ways falter. The strength to preserve peace no longer lies in elven songs or hobbit gardens. He moved, then, gliding across the room, Toward the veiled orb one hand reached out and gently touched the cloth. Even Mithrand is beginning to see it. Though he resists, he too knows the wind is changing. Kalen said nothing, but a prickle of unease ran down his spine. He wondered not for the first time whether Saruman's words were meant more as confession than conversation. You may go, the wizard said at last. Enjoy the comforts of Orthanc. They may be the last gentle days before the world awakens. Dismissed, Kalen bowed once more and left heart pounding. He could feel it now. Saruman was watching him more closely, weighing his presence with a cunning mind. He had to move quickly that night. He slipped again into the hidden stair near the well, his torch wrapped in cloth and his dagger sheathed. But ready, he returned to the lower levels, moving with quiet purpose through the smoke-laced corridors. The air was hotter now, as if the very bones of Orthanc had stirred. He passed the vat chambers, where machines bubbled and hissed and came. Again to Alandier's cell, the man-creature looked up. As he approached, a flicker of hope rising in those dim blue eyes. Kalen knelt beside him, working quickly at the rusted shackles. I've brought tools. I can break one of the chains, but the others, I'll need more time. Alandia nodded weakly. One is enough. I can move. First shackle snapped with a grating crack, and Alandir slumped forward, breathing heavily. He tried to rise, limbs trembling, but his body had not moved freely in many days. Kalen slipped under his arm, helping him to his feet. They crept through the corridor, dodging the soft glow of enchanted lanterns, and keeping to the cracks in the stone where shadows were thickest. Kalen had nearly reached the surface stair when a voice echoed down the passage. Head Elberin said he heard something below. Another test subject. Escape. Could be, answered a second voice, deeper in hoarse, or a rat. Two robed servants appeared at the far end of the corridor, carrying lanterns that glowed with eerie white light. Kalen ducked behind a pillar, clutching Alandir against the wall, holding his breath as footsteps drew closer. The light swept across the stone, nearly touching his foot, when a low groan echoed from deeper within the forge. Another of Saruman's failed experiments. Perhaps the guards turned abruptly and moved in the opposite direction, their voices fading. Seizing the moment, Kalen pulled Alandir toward the stairwell. By agonizing step, they climbed. The wounded ranger struggled, but the promise of freedom lent him strength at last. They reached a forgotten workshop chamber, just above the main forge, unused, silent, and hidden by time. Kalen helped Alandir to cot and passed him a water flask. Rest here. I'll bring food. I can't move you further until I find a way past the gates. Ellen gave a faint nod. I knew your face. Even in the dark, you wear the brooch of the Northern Watch. Kalen looked down. The silver pin on his cloak, shaped like a hawk in flight, had been his father's. He had not realized it was still visible. My father was a ranger, he said softly, killed in the western hills when the Dunlending's raided eye took his place. Andia gave a weak smile. Then it is well that the old strength lives on you, our brave Callan. But you must be careful. He watches everything, even the stones may listen in this place. Callan nodded, committing the warning to heart. He slipped from the room, locking the door from the outside, and placing a dull iron crest on it, a servant's mark rarely questioned. Then he made his way back to his quarters before the bells chimed. The next 2 days passed with excruciating slowness. Callan kept his face still, his speech polite. His eyes lowered all the while he listened and watched, marking the guards' paths, the shift of light through the tower's narrow slits. And the way supplies came in from below, not from without. Orthanc no longer relied on the world beyond. Its stores were brought up from caverns beneath, fed by a secret network even he had not yet found. On the third night, Saruman summoned the tower's servants to the central forge. Callan was not among them, but he climbed silently to a high alcove. He had discovered one that looked down upon the ritual chamber. Through a veil of stonework from this perch, he watched in horror. As Saruman raised his staff above the central crystal, its light now burning with white fire around him, the servants chanted in tones that sounded more dwarfish than mannish, their voices low and rhythmic, like the beating of a drum carved from bone. Then, from a great arch behind the forge, something was wheeled forth, tall, encased in steel, shaped like a man, but with no eyes, no mouth, and no soul. It stood nearly twice the height of a man, its limbs forged from blackened iron and silvered plates, its core glowing with the same strange fire as the crystal above. Runes ran across its chest like veins of gold. This was the Thalmech, finished, complete. And waiting, Saruman raised both hands and spoke the final words of the ritual. From iron shall rise dominion, from fire shall be born order. Thumech, awaken. A pulse of light surged through the room. The servant staggered back, the construct lifted its head. And Kaelin knew, in that dreadful moment, that the world changed forever. For a moment, Kaelin could not breathe. The forge chamber far below trembled with silent power. As the Thalmech took its first step forward, its foot, encased in jointed iron, struck the stone with a sound that rang through the bones of Orthanc like a death nail. The servants, silent and faceless as always, drew back in unison, not in fear, but with the mechanical obedience of those long since emptied of, while Saruman stood still, his arms outstretched, his white robes caught in a sudden wind that rose from the forge as though the air itself recoiled. There was no triumph in his face, only calm certainty, as if the rise of this new being had never been in doubt. The thorax turned its head slowly, deliberately, and for a dreadful second, Kellen thought it might be looking directly at him, despite the fact that it had no eyes. The moment passed, and the construct fell to one knee before the wizard, bowing its head like a knight before its king. Saruman moved to its side, placing a hand upon its broad, curved shoulder. Your name is Thalmech, he said in a voice that echoed through the forge. You are the first of your kind. You do not hunger, you do not tire. You do not question. You will stand when all others fall. And you will carry forth my will into a world that has forgotten strength. The Thormark did not respond, but something in its chest flickered, light or heat, or perhaps a memory, not its own. Then Saruman turned to the servants and gave a single nod. The ceremony was done. Kaelin slipped back from the alcove, heart racing. He had seen many strange things in his short life, wolves that walked like men, lights in the Barrow Downs, even a glimpse of an ant wandering the southern forest. But never anything so deeply wrong as this. The Thormark was no creature of Middle Earth. It was a perversion of it, something forged against the grain of nature itself. And it was only the first. He hurried back to the hidden workshop, where Alandia remained still, too weak to walk. Undead, the ranger was conscious, but pale, and his breath came shallow and slow. He looked up as Kaelin entered, eyes full of both recognition and urgency. You saw it. He rasped. It has begun. Yes, Kaelin said, kneeling beside him. I saw the thing Saruman has made. It walks now, and obeys. He means to build more an army. I think he's turning the very tower into a forge. Alandir tried to rise, but Kaelin held him gently in place. You must rest. I'm going to find a way out of here. There must be a passage, a drain, a tunnel, something under the walls. If I can get past the gates, I can reach the Ridmark. From their word will spread. Alandir nodded, though his face was tight with pain. You'll need to move quickly. Thormark is tested. It will not be long before he marches it beyond these walls. Kaelin left him with food and water, wrapping the door with the same servant seal. As before, then, he descended once more into the depths of Orthanc, determined now to find the hidden path that would lead him beyond the tower's grasp. If Saruman could conceal an entire forge, then surely there was more to discover. The air below was hotter than before, and the walls slick with condensation. The hum of power was stronger, too, pulsing Heartbeat deep in the stone, Kalen moved carefully, ears sharp for every footfall, every clang of metal or hiss of steam. At the far end of a corridor, lined with broken tools and rusted shelves, he found a rusted grate half buried in the wall. The stones around it had been discolored by time and damp, and the opening beyond was narrow, but it led downward, and it led out. He prized the grate loose, wincing at the groan of metal, and slipped inside. The tunnel was a crawl space, cramped and slick, filled with the stench. Old water and something else, something acrid and unnatural. It curved downward in a long spiral, and soon the last flicker of torchlight was lost behind him. He moved by touch, scraping knees and elbows, until at last the tunnel widened into a low chamber. Here a small underground stream trickled past a stone platform, and to his right an iron door stood half open, its hinges seized with rust. Beyond it, he found what he was looking for, a long, narrow passage choked with roots and dust that sloped gently upward toward a dim green light. The air smelled of moss and freedom. His heart lifted. He turned and made his way back to the workshop to fetch Ilandir. But as he reached the final stair, he heard footsteps, real ones, steady and purposeful, not the silent glide of a servant. Someone was coming. Kalen drew his dagger and pressed himself against the wall. Elberin emerged from the stairwell, holding a silver lantern in one hand. He looked around the chamber with eyes sharp and calculating, far clearer than any servant Kalen had yet seen. "I know someone is here," he said softly. "You leave traces, dust, where there should be none, a missing chain, a scratch on the iron door. Saruman thinks little of such details, but I do." Kalen held his breath, silent and unmoving. But Elberin stepped closer to the hidden door and placed a hand against it. "The prisoner is gone, isn't he? The broken one from the forge, the failure." He sighed almost sadly. "You don't understand what the Thalmor truly is, what it will mean. You think Saruman cruel, perhaps mad. But he is building something that will last when all else falls to ruin." Kalen saw the flicker of conviction in Elberin's face, not the blind obedience of the others, but belief. This man served Saruman not because he was compelled to, but because he chose to. That made him far more dangerous than. As Elberin turned to leave, Kalen stepped forward, striking swiftly. The blade drew, but the man twisted, catching Kalen's arm and driving him backward into the wall. They struggled, both breathing hard in the close dark. Kalen forced Elber onto the ground, pressing the dagger to his throat. "You'll say nothing," he whispered. "You'll turn back and tell him nothing." Elberin stared up at him, blood seeping from a cut above his brow. "You won't kill me, you're no murderer. I'll do what I must," Kalen said, though his voice shook. Elberin's eyes narrowed. "Then you're already becoming what he feared." Kalen bound him and dragged him to a storage cell, locking the door and placing a rung-cratched plate against it, one of Saruman's own wards stolen from a shelf days before it would hold. For now, he returned to Ilandir and helped him into the tunnel, the two of them moving slowly through the crawl space and into the underground streamway. The journey was long and painful, at times Eel and Deer stumbled, groaning softly, but they pressed on, driven by a fire stronger than fear. At last, they reached the mouth of the tunnel. They emerged beneath a tangled curtain of ivy. Outside the ring of Eisenard, beneath the pale glow of the moon, the wind on Kalen's face felt like a blessing. "We made it," he whispered. But the moment did not last. From behind them, deep within the bowels of Orthanc, a deep horn sounded 3 notes low, and terrible Saruman knew the forge had been breached, or Elberin had broken the seal, or some unseen eye had spoken of their escape. The hunt had begun. Kalen pulled the curtain of ivy clothes behind them, shielding the tunnel's mouth as best he could before helping Ilandir across the rocky slope. They were still within sight of the tower's outer ring, And though the trees clustered thickly to the west, the land near Eisenard was broken and bare in places, with only shallow ridges and outcroppings to offer cover. The horn's echo had faded, but its message lingered in the air like the scent of ash. Saruman knew someone had escaped, and it would not take him long to guess who they moved as swiftly as Ellen's injuries allowed, crossing a dry gully and entering a patch of dense thorn brush where Kaelin had seen foxes run in the days before there. Beneath the tangled limbs of a hawthorn tree, they stopped to catch their breath. Kaelin glanced over his shoulder half, expecting to see the thorac lurching into view, iron limbs glinting in the moonlight. But the slope behind them remained empty. "We need to get to the forest," he said quietly, more to himself than to Alandia. "If we reach the eaves of Fangorn, we might lose them. The trees will shelter us." Alandia gave a tired nod. His face was gray with pain, and he leaned heavily on Kaelin's shoulder. As they moved on, the road to Fangorn was neither short nor easy, but it was the only path they had south would take them into Rowan. But the plains offered no hiding places, and Kaelin feared Saruman's reach might already extend to the Ridmark. East lay the river, and the open lands beyond far too exposed. The forest, though strange and ancient, might yet serve as their shield. They trudged on through dark, making for the narrow ravine where the stream Kaelin had seen earlier cut through the hills. Hours passed. The moon rose high, then began to dip, and all the while they heard nothing. No horns, no hoofbeats, no voices. But Kaelin felt the chase tightening behind them, all the same, like a net drawn unseen through deep waters. Just before dawn they reached the edge of the ravine and slipped into its shadow, where the stream gurgled over moss-covered stones, and the air smelled of damp earth. They followed it eastward until the land opened into a meadow filled with tall grass and scattered stones. There, silhouetted against the silver sky, stood a figure. Palin froze, drawing Alandir down behind a rock. At first, he thought it might be a scout or servant, but the shape was wrong. The figure stood too still, and the way it turned its head smooth and precise made his stomach twist. "It's one of them," he whispered. The thing Saruman made. The Thormark stepped forward, one heavy foot after another, moving not with the lurch of a beast, but with the steadiness machine that knew its purpose. In its hand it held no sword or spear, only a gauntlet of iron that ended in 3 curved talons. Kaelin knew it would not need a weapon to kill. "We have to move now," he said, pulling Alandir upright and guiding him back toward the trees. The forest's edge lay a mile to the west, close, but not close enough. They stumbled through the grass, keeping low, weaving between stones. Kaelin dared not look back, but he could hear the faint hiss of iron cutting through wet grass, the relentless pace of something that did not tire. Then, from ahead, there came a sound, low and deep, like the groaning of the earth itself. A shape rose from behind the trees, taller than any man, wrapped in bark and shadow. Kaelin stopped short, heart thundering, as the figure took a single massive step forward. It was an ant. He had heard of them only in tales, the shepherds of the forest, ancient and slow, older even than the mountains. This one had the shape of a twisted beech tree, its limbs gnarled and moss-covered, its eyes deep-set hollows that gleamed faintly in the dawn light. The ant looked down at them with a gaze that was neither hostile nor welcoming, simply watching. Then it turned its eyes past them and let out a low growl that vibrated through the ground. Kaelin turned just in time to see the Thormark emerge from the grass. The 2 figures faced each other in the pale morning, the creature of iron and fire, and the being of wood and stone. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the Thormark raised its arm and charged. The ant moved faster than Kaelin thought possible. It met the blow with an outstretched limb that cracked against the metal arm like a fallen tree against stone. Sparks flew. The Thormark staggered, but did not fall. It slashed again, its claws raking across the ant's side, leaving long furrows in the bark. But the ant countered with a roar that shook the trees, swinging its other arm in a wide arc that sent the iron creature crashing to the ground. Run! Ant bellowed its voice like wind through canyon walls. Run, little ones. Kalen needed no urging. He hauled Ilandir to his feet and fled toward the trees, the ground trembling beneath them. As the two giants clashed again behind them, branches parted as they reached the forest's edge, and they plunged into the green gloom, where light filtered through the high canopy. And the air grew cooler, stiller, more watchful. They did not stop until the sounds of battle faded into silence, replaced by the quiet creaking of trees and the rustle of leaves overhead. Only then did Carlin lower Ilandir to the ground, gasping for breath. "Did you see it?" he said, chest heaving. "An ant, a real one." Lender nodded faintly, a weak smile on his cracked lips. "They say Fangorn wakes only for great danger. We must have stirred something." Ancient Kalen sat beside him, heart still pounding, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Saruman's creation, powerful though it had been held at bay, that gave him hope. But the fact that the Thaumark had come alone, not as a scout, but as a hunter, meant Saruman was growing bolder. The wizard would not stop with one. And the ant, though mighty, had been wounded. They rested there, some hours hidden beneath the roots of a fallen tree where the ground was soft, and the air smelled of pine and wet bark. Kalen took stock of their supplies, water, a little food, 2 knives, and a map drawn from memory. It would have to do when Ilandir could stand again. They would make for the eastern edge of the forest, where the old road led toward the Gap of Rohan. If they could reach the Rohirrim, there was still a chance to send word to Gandalf, or perhaps to King Theodan himself. But deep in his heart, Kalen knew they were no longer just messengers. They had seen too much. The war that was coming would not be fought with armies alone, nor would it be won by swords and courage. Saruman had begun something terrible, and only those who understood it could hope to stop it. A branch creaked above them. Kalen looked up, half expecting another ant, but it was only a raven, black and silent, perched on a high limb, its head tilted, as if listening. Too many eyes, he thought, too many ears. He helped Ilandir to his feet once more, and together they moved deeper into the forest, following the path where sunlight barely touched the mossy ground around them. Fangorn whispered. The trees bent and swayed as if aware of their presence. And though the forest said nothing, it remembered. And far behind them, deep within the forge halls of Orthanc, Saruman stood before the Thalmec, its limbs scorched and armor cracked from battle. And he laid his hand upon it with something close to reverence. "We will make you stronger," he said. "Next time you will not fall." For 3 days, Kalen and Islander journeyed through the heart of Fangorn, winding their way beneath the towering trees, whose roots curled like sleeping serpents, and whose trunks reached skyward like ancient pillars. The forest was unlike any Kalen had known. The air felt thick with age and memory, and though they were never directly threatened, both men walked with a constant sense of being watched. Leaves rustled without wind, distant creaks echoed like footsteps, and now and again they glimpsed fleeting shapes between the trees, tall, slow moving, half hidden in the green shadows. Kalen trusted the forest more than he trusted the roads, but even the forest had rules. They lit no fires, spoke only in whispers, and left no mark. Where they camped, Ilandir was recovering, though slowly. He could walk without support by the 2nd day, and by the 3rd he had regained enough strength to keep pace, though he moved with the weariness of someone who had carried pain too long. They found a small stream that fed into a wider brook, its waters clean and cold. Filled their flasks, the land sloped gently downward as they walked eastward toward the place where the Antwash ran along the forest's edge. Kayla knew the route would bring them close to Rohan's western border, and if they were lucky, they might find a patrol or a watchtower where they could leave word of what they had seen. But luck, Kaelin had learned, was a rare companion that night as they camped beneath the shelter of a giant beech, whose roots formed a hollow just wide enough for them to rest. A lender stirred uneasily in his sleep, muttered something Kaelin could not quite hear, and jerked suddenly upright, eyes wide. And staring eyes saw it again. He said, voice in my dreams, the forge, the fire, the Thormatch, standing above me. It spoke Kaelin. It said my name. Kaelin frowned. It can't speak. It has no voice. Ellen looked at him, his expression shadowed with fear, not in words, but in thought and fire. It remembers me. I think it's part of me. Chill ran down Kaelin's spine. He knew Saruman's alchemy was more than just science or smithcraft. There had been magic in it, dark and old, twisted from the roots of something deeper. If the Thormatch was born of stolen life, then, perhaps, it carried echoes of the ones whose flesh and spirit had been torn apart to make it. Perhaps Alendir, even freed, had left something of himself behind in that monstrous creation. We'll get to Rohan, Kaelin said, firmly trying to steady his own voice. We'll tell them everything. Gandalf will know what to do. He always does. The reassurance rang hollow, and both men knew. They rose early the next morning, following the narrowing trail. As the trees began to thin, the forest lightened, though the sky remained gray with cloud. And soon the ground beneath their feet was mossy and soft. Then, as they crested a low hill, they saw it, a wooden watchtower, weathered, but still standing, perched near the edge of the Antwash. Hope surged in Kaelin's chest. He broke into a run, a lander close behind, and within minutes they were standing at the base of the structure, hung limp from its pole, marked with the white horse of Rohan, though its edges were frayed and stained by rain. The ladder had been pulled up, but Kaelin cupped his hands and called out, "Riders of the Mark, we seek the king's protection. I carry word from Mithrand the Great." There was silence. Then a scrape of wood above a helmeted face appeared, peering over the side. After a moment, the guard lowered the ladder and motioned them up. Inside, they found 3 men of Rohan, young, wearied, and well armed. They listened to Colin's story with furrowed brows, though disbelief flickered on their faces. When he spoke of the Thormark, one of them, a stout rider named Harl, finally interrupted. "You're telling us Saruman has built a man of iron, a thing that thinks and hunts like a beast?" Kaelin nodded. "I saw it with my own eyes. It nearly caught us in the fields beyond Eisenard. And worse, he's building more. He's using men, rangers, maybe prisoners, binding their spirits with fire and metal." The 3 riders exchanged uneasy glances. At last, their captain, a lean man with a scar beneath one eye, spoke. "If what you say is true, then the king must know. There's been talk of strange lights near the tower, but we were told to stay clear. Orders from higher up. From Saruman himself, I'd wager," muttered Harl. The captain nodded. "Perhaps. But if Midhender sent you, then you'll ride with us to Eddors. We'll put your words before Theoden. Let him judge." Kaelin agreed at once, and Alandir, though worn thin by the journey, offered no protest. That night they slept in the tower's shelter, warm for the first time in days. And though the dreams still came, filled with fire and chains and echoing steps, they were not alone. By morning they rode south, beneath a cold sun, the plains of Rohan stretching wide around them. The fields were golden with withered grass, and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. Kaelin felt a strange mix of dread and relief as the horizon changed, the high ridges of the White Mountains slowly rising into view. 2 days passed without incident. The company moved swiftly, resting only when the horses needed it. But on the 3rd evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long over the plain, one of the riders gave a sharp cry and pointed toward the hills. At first Kaelin saw nothing, then across the golden fields saw movement, shapes fast and low to the ground, skimming the grass like hunting dogs. "They're not men," said Hull, gripping his spear. "Not orcs either. What, in the name of the valor?" The creatures came into view, small and wiry, with skin like dark iron and glowing eyes. They moved with uncanny speed, arms jointed with metal, and their bodies glinted in the sun like forged armor. There were 5 of them, no more, but they spread out like a pack and began to circle. Kaelin's blood ran cold. These were not the tower, but they were its kin. Saruman had loosed more than a single hunter. He had made scouts form a ring, shouted the captain's shields high. The riders closed in around Kaelin and Islander, who drew his blade despite the pain etched into every line of his face. The scouts did not howl or hiss. They made no sound at all. They simply struck. The first leapt from the grass and slammed into Hull's shield. Claws, screeching against the wood, Hull stabbed upward and sent it tumbling. But another followed close behind, darting with insect-like speed toward Alandia. Kaelin lunged in its path, his blade flashing in the fading light. The thing was fast, too fast, but not invincible. His sword found the joint beneath its shoulder. Sparks flew as it crumpled all around them. The battle raged silent, but deadly steel met iron, and flesh cried out. 2 scouts fell shattered beneath the rider's blows, but the others moved with terrifying precision, as if guided by a single will. And Callan knew in that moment that they were far away in the heart of Orthanc. Saruman stood before his palantir, hand resting on the dark stone, and watched. The battlefield was a blur of motion and steel, lit only by the dying sun and the brief blinding flashes. Iron on iron strikes. Kaelin could hardly think, only react. One of the scouts leapt past the captain's spear and hurtled toward him with inhuman speed, its limbs moving in swift, twitching bursts. He ducked instinctively, the creature's claws grazing the side of his cloak, and then turned sharply to drive his sword into its side. It shrieked, not with a voice, but with a high metallic wail that rang like a snapped wire. Sparks burst from its wound as it spasmed and collapsed, twitching in the tall grass nearby. Alandia fought with grim determination, using short, precise strikes to drive his attacker backward. He bled from a cut across the brow, but his stance held firm. One of the riders lay unmoving on the ground behind them, chest pierced by an iron talon, and another was staggering back, his shield arm limp. There were only 2 scouts left now, but they moved in near perfect coordination, flanking the group with swift, darting feints that kept the riders off balance. The captain barked an order in Rohirric, and the remaining guards tightened their formation, hurrying Kaelin and Elenir to the center. Then, without warning, one of the scouts veered away and sprinted back across the field, vanishing into the grass and the growing dark. "It's retreating," Alandia said, breathing hard. "No," Kaelin said, heart sinking as he watched the shape disappear. "It's reporting." The captain lowered his blooded sword, nodding grimly. "Then we must ride." He did not linger to burn the fallen enemy, nor to bury the slain rider. The remaining scout dissolved into the gathering shadows, and though it did not attack again, its absence was no comfort. They mounted in silence and rode hard into the night, guided only by the stars and the faint outline of the distant mountains. The next day passed in a blur of dust, and whined, the riders taking shifts to rest in the saddle, while the horses galloped on. By evening, they reached the ridges above the valley of Herodale. There nestled base of the White Mountains, and gleaming in the orange light, stood Edoras, the golden hall of meadow crowning the hill like a jewel set in stone. Kaelin felt a wave of exhaustion sweep over him as the sight of the city settled in his chest. It had taken every ounce of his strength to bring Alandir this far, to escape Orang and its shadow, to endure the madness of Fangorn and the quiet horror of Saruman's creations. But they had made it at last, They had reached the court of the king. As they approached the gates, the guards called out in challenge, but the captain lifted his hand and spoke quickly in their tongue. The gates opened, and the company passed through hooves ringing on the cobbled street. As they climbed the hill toward the hall, the riders of Rohan did not dock. Halen and Elender were given water, food, and a place to wash before they were led through the great wooden doors of Medjusel. Inside the hall was warm and golden, filled with the scent of firewood and horse leather. The raft is high and carved with tales of old battles and long-forgotten kings. Far end, seated upon a throne of blackened wood, beneath a woven tapestry of the Mark's heraldry, sat King Theoden. He was older than Kaelin expected, his face lined with care and weariness, but his gaze was sharp and steady. At his right stood a tall man with dark hair and a grave expression, a nephew to the king and marshal of the Ridmark. At his left, leaning slightly on a staff of twisted ashwood, stood a man in grey robes, with keen eyes beneath bushy brows. Kaelin's heart let Gandalf, the wizard, stepped forward the moment he saw them, placing a hand gently on Kaelin's shoulder. "So you came back," he said softly, as if the world hadn't changed since they last spoke. Kaelin, too weary to speak at once, simply nodded. Then he looked at the king, gathering the last of his strength. "Your Majesty, I bring word from Eisenard. Saruman is no longer the wight you once knew. He is building something terrible deep in the Tower of Orthanc. He has forged a creature from metal and sorcery, a weapon shaped like a man, but hollow inside. He calls it the Thou. I saw it rise." The hall fell silent, the flickering fire casting long shadows on the golden walls. Theoden frowned, but did not interrupt. Kaelin continued, his voice stronger now. "He's not working alone. I saw failed versions, twisted things, part man, part machine. One of them was a ranger," he remembered, "who he was even after what Saruman did to him. I helped him escape. I saw the forge the machines. The alchemy. Saruman has built an army of watchers, silent scouts made of iron. We were attacked on the plains." At this, Gandalf stepped forward, his voice grave. "I feared he had begun such work," he said. "I feared it when he first studied the secrets of Owl without guidance, when he turned his mind to metals rather than the making of peace. But I had no proof now. We have witness." Aemir looked from Gandalf to the king. "This is no longer a question of sorcery or rebellion. If Saruman is forging weapons like these, then Rohan is already under threat." Theoden leaned back in his throne, his fingers drumming the carved wood. "And yet he has not marched," said slowly. "He has not crossed the fords, nor laid siege. Eisenard remains quiet outwardly. It waits," said Gandalf, his voice firm. "He tests, and he watches. But make no mistake, he will move. When he does, he will bring something no spear wall can stop." There was a long silence in the hall, broken only by the crackling of the hearth. Then the king stood. "Then let him come," he said. "Rohan does not run from shadow. We will meet him in the field, if we must. But the tower will be watched more closely from now on. And if he steps beyond his walls, he will find the mark is not so easily broken." Gandalf turned to Kaelin and nodded. "You have done well, my friend. Few have walked the halls of Orthanc and lived to speak of it. Fewer still have escaped with truth." Kaelin exhaled, the tension finally loosening in his shoulders. He looked to Alandia, who leaned quietly against a pillar, the color beginning to return to his cheeks. But even in that moment of safety, Kaelin could not shake the feeling that the battle had only just begun. Far to the north, behind the black walls of Eisenard, Saruman stood alone in his high chamber, gazing into the Palantir. A figure of iron and fire stood silent before him, taller, now stronger, its chest marked with new runes. The first failed to kill the ranger. It had been made with caution, with limits. The next would know no such constraints. For 2 days, Kaelin remained in Edoras, under the watchful eye of King Theodan's court. resting within the high walls of Medjugorje. While Alandia recovered under the care of the royal healers, the air in the city was fresh touched by the chill from the White Mountains. And the people moved with purpose. There were more guards, now more than when they had first arrived, and the banners that flew over the Golden Hall hung heavy. A sense of silent anticipate news of Saruman's treachery had already begun to spread. And though the king had not declared war, the riders of Rohan were being readied for something greater than patrols. Kaelin spent his morning speaking with Gandalf, who questioned him carefully, often walking with him along the outer halls. While listening with sharp eyes and quiet attention, Gandalf asked not only what he had seen, but how it had felt, what the machine sounded like, how the air had changed within the tower, what names Saruman had whispered in the dark. Kaelin tried to answer each question with care, though sometimes the memories caught him off guard, and he would fall silent, gripped by the image of the Thormax's hollow eyes, or the green fire flickering beneath the crystal in the forge. "It is worse than I feared," Gandalf said one evening, as they stood by a window, looking toward the north. "I thought Saruman might be toying with forbidden knowledge, but he has taken it further. He has crossed into creation, a dark mimicry of the powers that shape the world. The Thormach is not a weapon. It is a challenge to the very laws of Middle-earth. Can it be stopped?" Kaelin asked quietly. Gandalf did not answer. At once, his face was lined with weariness, his eyes distant. At last, he said, "Perhaps, but not with blades alone." Later that day, Kaelin found himself standing before Theoden again, this time at the king's request. The hall was less crowded, the torches lower, and Amir stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. "You spoke true," Theoden said, his tone neither warm nor cold. "And for that Rohan owes you thanks. But the winds from Isengard grow more bitter. By the hour scouts report movement, wagons, strange fires. At night, strange sounds near the western roads. He's preparing to strike," Kaelin said. "If not now, then soon. He's testing your response." Theoden nodded. "And we shall not sit idle. But I would ask more of you." Kaelin of the North. Kaelin met his gaze steady despite the fatigue he still carried. "What would you have me do?" "There is a man I would send east, a rider named Wulfstan. He knows the paths between the rivers, and he is loyal. But he knows nothing of what you've seen you do. I would have you go with him to scout the lands near Isengard again. But not alone this time. You'll have aid, and a chance to see whether Saruman's designs have spread beyond his walls." Gandalf, standing behind the king, inclined his head slightly. "It may be dangerous," he said, "but it may also be our last chance to understand what Saruman truly means to do before the storm breaks." Kaelin hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'll go that evening." He spoke with Elendar, who had grown stronger with each day, though he still bore the shadows of his time. Beneath Orthanc, the older ranger clasped his forearm firmly, eyes bright with pride. "I should be the one riding out again," he said with a tired smile. "But since I can't, I'm glad it's you. I'll bring back word," Kaelin promised, "and I'll make sure they understand what we're facing." Before dawn the next morning, Kaelin departed Eddis with Wulfstan and a small company of 3 other riders. They rode lightly, avoiding the main roads, keeping to the ridges and hollows of the plains. Wulfstan was a seasoned scout, quiet but sharp-eyed, with a thick mane of hair the color of rusted copper, and a way of listening to the wind that reminded Kaelin of the rangers from the north. The others, Cedric, Branimir, and 2 were younger but capable, each chosen for speed and loyalty. Their first 3 days passed without incident. They moved swiftly, making for the southern slopes, near watching for any signs of patrols or wagons. The land remained still, though it was no longer silent. Twice they heard strange howls in the night, too high for wolves, too low for men. Once they saw a column of smoke rising briefly in the distance black and thick. But it vanished before they reached its source. On the fourth day, they came upon a strange sight. They had just crested a low rise in the hills when Wulfstan raised a hand to halt them below. Nestled between the roots of a rocky outcrop stood a circle of standing stones, old and cracked with age. But what caught their eyes were the bodies. 5 men lay in the center. Unmoving, they wore no armor, but their clothes bore the markings of laborers or merchants, and their faces were pale with death. Their eyes had been closed, but their hands were folded upon their chest with strange precision, and around each wrist was a band of blackened iron. What in the name of the valor? Muttered Wulfstan, dismounted, and approached slowly, sword drawn. Kaelin followed, keeping his own blade ready. As they drew near, the air turned cold unnaturally so, and the wind seemed to falter. The ground within the stone circle was scorched, and in the very center, etched into the dirt, was a rune Kaelin had seen only once before, on the chest of the first Thorma. This is one of his testing sites, Kaelin said quietly. These men were test subjects like Elendil. Cedric knelt beside one of the corpses and touched the iron band. Its fused to the skin, burned in place. Wilfin looked to Kaelin, his jaw set. We ride back. The king must know of this, and so must Gandalf. But even as he spoke, Kaelin caught a sound behind them, the soft crunch of footsteps on dry earth. He turned, eyes narrowing, and saw shapes moving through the grass. They were not alone. Emerging from the tall grass were 4 figures, moving slowly and deliberately. At first glance, they looked like men cloaked in dark leather, but as they drew closer, it became clear that their bodies moved stiffly, and that the gleam beneath their cloaks was not fabric, but metal. Their faces were hidden beneath masks of tarnished bronze, and from their backs hung long cables like braids of chain. They're not Falmucks, Kaelin whispered. There's something else. Back to the horses, Walston ordered, but it was too late. The metal figures moved with sudden speed, raising weapons that looked like spears grafted from bone and black iron. One threw its arm forward, and the spear flashed through the air, striking Cedric square in the chest. He crumpled before he could even cry out. The others turned and drew their weapons, forming a loose ring around Kaelin and Wulfstan. The creatures didn't speak. They didn't breathe. They simply closed in silence as Death Wulfstan shouted for the others to fall back. Ranamir hesitated, torn between retreat and battle. Kaelin didn't wait. He lunged forward to drag the wounded Cedric back behind a low rise. But the ground was uneven, and Cedric's armor caught on a stone. One of the masked figures raised its blade and moved with terrifying speed, its stride inhuman and smooth, gliding more than walking. Wulfstan blocked the blow just in time, his sword sparking against the curved iron blade. And for a brief second, the two stood locked, steel grinding against steel. Neither giving ground. Kaelin crouched low, using his weight to haul Cedric out of reach. While men closed ranks, Cedric groaned faintly, blood running from beneath his mail. But his eyes were still open, and he nodded once in silent thanks before slipping into unconsciousness. Kaelin dropped behind a fallen log, sword in hand, breath sharp in his throat. The attackers moved without sound or hesitation, working together, as if sharing one mind. The way they turned, flanked, and pressed the riders spoke of coordination far beyond chance. Instinct Poor loosed a throwing knife and struck one in the shoulder. The weapon sank into the joint, but the creature did not falter. It merely turned toward him, an advanced blade sweeping in a low arc that forced to back. Wulfstan fought like a man possessed, parrying and countering, his movements clean and efficient. Yet even he seemed to sense the truth. These were not foes that could be scattered by fear or worn down by exhaustion. They would not stop unless broken completely. Kalen rose from his cover, just long enough to hurl a stone at the nearest enemy. It clanged off its helm, drawing its attention. And for a heartbeat that was all Wolf's Dan needed, he slammed the pommel of his sword into the creature's side, then drove his blade up through the hollow. Beneath the chin of its mask, sparks burst from the wound, followed by a hiss of smoke. And the thing collapsed, twitching. The others paused, perhaps, registering the loss. Kalen could feel them calculating. If such things could think, mount up. Wallstand barked, already moving toward the horses. Get Cedric on his steed. He's not dead yet, Branimir. And to obeyed, without question, dragging Cedric's limp form onto one of the lighter horses. Cullen backed away slowly, blades still ready, never turning from the enemies. But they did not follow. Instead, they stood still, as statues' heads cocked slightly to one side, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Then, all at once, they turned and walked back into the tall grass, vanishing like ghosts into the wind. No one spoke until they were a mile away, the horses galloping hard over the plains, hooves pounding against dry earth. Only when they reached the safety of a narrow ravine did Wolfstand call a halt. They dismounted, quickly checking Cedric's wound. It was deep, but the spear had missed his heart, and Branimir's quick binding had stopped the worst of the bleeding. Kalen crouched beside him, brushing the dust from his face. Hold on, he said, gripping Cedric's hand. We're getting you back to Adaros. You're going to be all right. Cedric's lips moved faintly, but no sound came out. His eyes were clouded, but they still held a spark of recognition. Then they fluttered shut once more to lean heavily on a boulder nearby, still catching his breath. What were they? He asked, voice roar. Kalen wiped his sword clean. Another of Saruman's forges. I think the Thack was only the beginning. These were centuries, quieter, faster, but no less deadly. They moved like they weren't alive, said Branimir, glancing nervously at the grass behind them. But they weren't dead either. They weren't orcs. Wolfstan muttered, sheathing his blade. They weren't anything I've seen before. Kalen nodded slowly. Because there's something new. Saruman is trying to build more than an army. He's trying to replace it with machines that don't sleep, don't eat, don't question. He's not just turning against the free peoples. He's trying to make himself a force that no kingdom can resist. They rode through the rest of the night, resting only briefly under cover of a thicket. By morning, they were moving again, taking the long road toward Edoras, with Cedric tied securely in the saddle. The journey was slower now, but no one suggested splitting up. If the scouts were still following them, it would be safer to remain together. Kalen couldn't help glancing behind them, often scanning the horizon for any glint of metal or shadowed movement in the grass. When at last they passed beneath the golden banners of Edoras, it was nearly dusk. Riders at the gate rushed to help them. As Wolfsten called out, Cedric was carried to the healing hall at once, and the rest of the company made straight for Meduseld, where the king, aided Theodan, met them at the great doors, flanked by Amer. And two of his guards, Gandalf, stood nearby, arms folded, expression grave. Callan stepped forward, dirt-streaked and weary, and gave his report quickly, but clearly, of the bodies near the stone circle, the rune in the earth, and the metal-clad sentries that moved without breath or mercy. They listened in silence, his gaze fixed on some far-off place. Only he could see. When Callan finished, the hall remained still for a long moment before the king spoke. It is as we feared. Saruman is no longer preparing, he is acting. Gandalf stepped beside him. His works grow bolder. What was once done in secret now spills into the land. And these new centuries, he has found a way to send his will beyond the tower. He watches, not only with eyes, but with thoughts. His creations are his hands in the world. Elmer's face darkened. Then we must strike first, if he means to send more of these abominations into Rohan. We cannot wait behind our walls. There may be another way, Gandalf said. Slowly, Saruman's pride is vast, but his foundation lies in what he has built. If we can strike at the forge, destroy it. His plans may falter, the Thormark cannot be sustained without the heart of the fire that fuels it. Kaelin stepped forward. I saw the forge, I remember the path, I know the way into the lower chambers. The wizard met his eyes, a gleam of something like admiration passing across his face. Then, you may yet be the key. Palin looked from Kaelin to Gandalf, then to his guards. Assemble a small company. He said, we will not march in force, not yet, but we will send fire into the dark and see how the tower reacts. Wulfstan nodded. I will ride. And I said, Kaelin, whatever lies within Orthanc, I have seen it once, I can face it again. As the council dispersed and the plans were set in motion, Kaelin stood alone for a moment on the stone steps of Medjugorje, watching the stars rise over the plains. The wind whispered across the hills, cool and clean, but it could not wash away the memory of fire or the sound of hollow footsteps on the grass. He had escaped Saruman's forge. Once now, he would return not as a spy, but as a spark meant to ignite the storm. 2 nights later, under a waning moon, Kaelin rode out from Eddowes once more, this time not as a lone messenger or fugitive, but as part of a chosen company. The king had kept his word. The group was small, just 7 riders, swift and silent, armed for sabotage rather than battle. Walston led them again, his grim calm unwavering despite what they now knew they faced, or had volunteered without hesitation. And though Branimir bore fresh wounds from the last journey, he had refused to be left behind. 2 more had been chosen from among Rohan's scouts, and with them rode one stranger, Ulrich, a Gondorian smith turned soldier who had studied runes and firecraft in the archives of Minnie's Tithe. Gandalf had insisted on his presence, saying that they would need not only swords to face what waited in the depths of Orthanc, but understanding of what burned beneath. They left quietly through the east gate, cutting across the open plains by hidden routes known only to the riders of the mark. Kaelin felt a strange mix of dread and resolve tightening in his chest. He had fled Isengard once and barely survived. Now he was riding back into its shadow by choice. But there was no room for fear. Too much had been seen, too much was now at stake. Their plan was simple, if dangerous. They would approach Isengard by night bypass the broken outer gate Kaelin had escaped through, and slip into the hidden tunnels beneath. Orthanc, the same ones he had used weeks before. Once inside, they would make their way to the forge and destroy it by any means they could. Ulrich carried 2 casks of black powder, wrapped in old cloth, one slung across his saddle, the other packed beneath his cloak. Neither he nor Gandalf had explained where the powder had come from, but Kaelin didn't ask if it could bring down the forge. That was all that mattered. On the 3rd day, they passed into the outer lands near Isengard, where the grass grew stiff and dry, and the trees seemed to lean away from the wind. No birds called in the branches, no beasts stirred in the brush. The land itself felt wrong, as though it had swallowed something that soured its roots. That night they camped without fire, wrapped in thick cloaks to ward off the chill, listening to the distant groan of some unseen engine humming through the hills. The following evening, just after sunset, they reached the northern edge of the Isen Valley. The great circle of stone that had once ringed Orthanc was now cracked in several places. The gates opened long ago and left to rust, but no army had come forth. No guards lined the walls. The tower stood tall and silent in the distance, dark against the sky, but its crown pulsed faintly with red light like an ember hidden in ash. They dismounted in the low gully where Kaelin had once hidden with a deer, and moved carefully through the underbrush until they reached the ivy-covered opening that led to the forgotten tunnel. Kaelin checked the passage, first removing the stone slab that had sealed it the way remained as it had, in cramp and damp. But unguarded one by one, the others followed him inside, crawling through the narrow shaft, with their weapons strapped tight, and their breath shallow. The descent was long, and suffocating. The black powder casks had to be passed hand to hand. And more than once, someone slipped on the wet stone, muffling their curses behind clenched teeth. But after an hour, they emerged into the lower chamber beneath Orthanc, the very place Kaelin had first found her, though now the chains were gone, and the floor scrubbed clean to Drew. His sword, and held it low, its two quiet wolf's den knotted keep. Moving, they advanced through the lower levels in silence, using only the faint glow of Ari's rune lamp to guide them. Kaelin led them with confidence, his memory sharper than ever. The walls had changed. Since his escape, new symbols had been carved into the stone winding scripts in a language none of them knew. The air was warmer now, filled with a faint scent of burning oil and molten metal. Somewhere ahead, the forge still lived. At last, they reached the outer passage that led to the chamber. Kaelin remembered. He held up a hand, and the company halted. The air beyond the arch shimmered faintly like heat rising from a summer road. Ulrich stepped forward, peering closely at the threshold. "There's a ward here," he said quietly. "Old craft, fire tide. Not elvish, not dwarvish. Either. This is the work of someone trying to shape power from knowledge alone. Dangerous. Can you break it?" asked Wolfstein. Ulrich nodded, unrolling a small satchel of powder and tools. "Give me a moment. But once it drops, they may know we're here." The men formed a circle around him. As he worked, the only sound, the faint scrape of metal on stone. Kaelin watched the shadows, closely straining to hear anything beyond the walls. But the tower remained silent. At last, Ulrich poured a final circle of dust and whispered a word. The shimmer vanished. They pushed through the archway and entered the forge. It was larger than Kaelin remembered. The ceiling soared high into darkness, filled with hanging chains and iron beams. The great crystal still hovered above the center, bound in a cage of black steel, pulsing with light below it. The forges roared, feeding channels of fire that flowed through carved runes into vats, gears, and pipes. On the far wall, 3 new thalmecs stood dormant, each taller than the last, their frames sleek, and segmented their chests marked with fresh runes that glowed faintly red. "This is it," Kaelin whispered. "This is where it begins." Eric wasted no time. He and Walston moved quickly to the main vat, locating the base of the forge. Where the heat concentrated, they placed the first cask against the central support and set the timer rune. The second was buried in the fuel supply beneath the crystal as they worked toward. And Branner watched the chamber doors, while Kaelin moved to the side, eyes locked on the silent Thormark. He couldn't help but feel they were watching him even in sleep. He stepped closer to one, peering into its featureless mask. Heartbeat, he thought he heard something, a voice not loud or clear, but present, a whisper. "Hey, Callan." He staggered back, breath catching in his throat. He hadn't imagined it. The Thormax's eyes flickered, once red and sharp, like coals beneath ash. "They're waking," he shouted. "Aldrich, hurry." Ulrich cursed and scrambled back from the casks. "Done, we need to go now." But it was too late. One of the Thormesh stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its arms unfolding with the hiss of steam and the creak of hidden pistons. Its head turned toward them, eyes blazing. Another followed, then the third. The forge erupted with light as the crystal above fled, casting the chamber in harsh red shadows. Pipes burst, fire roared through the channels, and the very floor trembled beneath their feet. "Run!" Wolfston bellowed, drawing his sword. They sprinted for the archway, dodging sparks and falling debris. One of the Thormek lunged, its iron arms slamming into the ground, where it had stood a moment before Branimir threw a knife into its shoulder. But it barely noticed. Kaelin reached the doorway, then turned back, grabbed Ulrich by the cloak, and hauled him through as the forge behind them groaned like a wounded beast. Then the first explosion came. The explosion tore through the lower levels of Orthanc with a roar like thunder. Cracking through stone, the floor beneath Kaelin's feet heaved, and he was thrown into the passage wall as a blast of heat surged past them, followed by a hail of shattered metal and smoke behind them. The forge chamber became a furnace of flame, and ash pipes burst with the force of ruptured veins pouring molten metal across the floors. One of the thorac let out a sound, not a scream, but a shrill grinding shriek that echoed with static fury. And then it collapsed, its armor splitting apart in glowing fragments that scattered across the ground like pieces of a broken star. Wolfstand hauled Carlin upright, shouting something that was lost in the roar. Ulrich staggered to his feet, half blinded by the blast, his hands scorched and blackened where the second cask had ignited. Banamir and two emerged from the smoke behind them, coughing and bleeding, but alive. The path back the way they had come was already filling with fire and rubble. This way, Kaelin shouted, pointing toward a narrow side corridor he had glimpsed during his first descent. Tower, it leads to the storage levels. I think we can make it out. They didn't hesitate. Wolf took the lead, cutting through the thick smoke with his cloak wrapped around his mouth. Ulrich followed close behind, limping slightly, and the others brought up the rear, weapons drawn, listening for the sound of pursuing footsteps. But no feet followed them, only the groaning of the tower itself, a sound that seemed almost alive with fury. The blast had not destroyed Orthanc. Nothing so simple could shatter the stone of the Numenorans, but it gutted Kammon's forge, and with it, the machinery of his alchemical army. Flames licked the walls of the passage as they ran, and somewhere above them, something cracked with a deep echoing boom, as though a great weight had shifted far overhead. They reached the far end of the tunnel, just as part of the ceiling gave way behind them, blocking the route with burning debris. Wolf Stang shoved open a rusted iron door, and they stumbled into a small circular chamber lined with shelves. It was empty now, save for a few scorched books and cracked vials, and the air was thick with dust and smoke. Kaelin scanned the walls quickly and found the narrow hatch he remembered, half hidden behind a broken beam. Through here, he said, already crawling inside. It leads to the escape shaft. The others followed one by one, forcing themselves into the narrow space behind them. The flames crackled louder, and the stone groaned, as if resisting the heat with all its ancient strength. At last, they emerged into the crawlway that opened beyond the ivy-covered tunnel. Kaelin shoved the last stones aside and burst into the cool night air, gasping as if he had been drowning. The others followed close behind, collapsing into the grass, one by one, coughing and covered in soot. Above them, Orthanc stood silent, but glowing. Smoke curled from cracks in the foundation, and the faint red light that once crowned the tower had vanished. The night sky seemed darker, as if the stars themselves had dimmed in mourning. They didn't linger. Wolf Stem ordered the group to the horses they had hidden in a hollow nearby, and within minutes they were galloping away from the tower at full speed. Kaelin glanced over his shoulder only once, and in that moment he thought he saw a figure high in the tower's window, tall, robed in white, with eyes like twin coals burning in shadow. Saruman had survived. They didn't stop riding until the first pale light of dawn crept across the plains. The wind shifted as they rode, carrying with it the scent of scorched earth and old stone. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and the ruins of the forge did they allow the horses to slow. Ulrich slumped in his saddle, breathing heavily, his hands bandaged with strips torn from Tor's cloak. We did it, Branimir said at last. Voice, we broke the forge. Kaelin Galen nodded, though his expression was grim. We slowed him, that's all. But it's a start. Wilton looked back toward the smudge of smoke, still rising on the horizon. He'll be furious. And he'll move faster. Now no more testing. No more experiments. The next blow will be open. They rode on in silence, the weight of what they had done heavy upon their shoulders, though they had crippled Saruman's creations and destroyed the heart of his forge. The wizard remained. And now his mask had fallen. There would be no more pretense, no more diplomacy or hidden doors. War had begun by the time they reached Edoras 3 days later. The city was already preparing. Banners flew from every tower, and lines of riders drilled in the fields below the hill. The people moved with purpose, no longer guessing at the danger, but knowing it. Saruman's fury had not gone unnoticed. Smoke had been seen from afar, and though the tower had not fallen, the blast had reached the ears of many. Rumors flew like birds. Some said Rohan had struck first, others that Saruman had tested a weapon of flame. Only the king and a few others knew the truth. Theoden met them in the great hall once more, and this time his face bore no question. He listened to their tale without interruption. His jaw clenched, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. When Walston finished, the king rose and walked to the window, looking northward. So, he said, the white wizard reveals his black heart. Then let him know we do not cower. Let him know the Ridmark will not fall to machines and flame. Ehrman turned to Gandalf, who had remained silent throughout what happens now. Gandalf's eyes glittered. Now we ride. Galen stood by the door, still covered in the dust of the tunnel, his heart beating steady and hard. He had seen the beginning. He had walked into the furnace and returned not as a scout, but as a witness to a fire that would spread yet. As the king spoke, and the riders gathered their arms, Galen found no fear in him, only purpose. Far away, in the still burning tower of Orthanc, Saruman stood before the shattered remains of his forge. The Thoramak lay in pieces, molten and blackened its core. Extinguished, his hand rested on the palantir, and through its dark lens he watched the plains, so they strike like thieves in the night. He said softly, good, let them come, as warriors. Next I have seen what lies beyond fire. He turned toward the shadowed corner of the chamber, where a new figure waited, taller than the last, cloaked in veils of smoke, and steel. Its eyes opened, glowing with a deeper light than the ones before. This time Saruman whispered, you will not fall. Riders of Rohan did not delay. Within days of Galen's return, Edoras became a city of war. The stables rang with the sound of hooves, and the clatter of armor smithies glowed well into the night. And messengers galloped across the mark, with orders sealed by the king's own hand. Horns called through the valleys, and companies from the outer villages rode south to join the host, gathering beneath the white banner of the horse. Even the older warriors, who had once laid down their swords, came forward to stand again. Their grim but proud Theoden had declared that Rohan would not wait for Saruman to strike again. The time had come to ride north. Galen found himself swept into preparations, not as a guest or a scout this time, but as part of the vanguard itself. Wallen named him to his company, and though Galen was younger than most who bore shield and sword in the king's service, none questioned the decision word of his escape from Orthanc, the destruction of the forge, and the strange fire that had risen behind the tower had bred through the ranks like wind across tall grass. Some called him a shadow walker, others a flame bearer, though Galen paid the names little mind. He spent his days sharpening blades, training with the other riders, and meeting often with Gandalf, who now moved through the city like a storm waiting to break. Gandalf spoke little of what lay ahead, though Galen could see the tension in his movements, the urgency behind each council with the king. There was no laughter in him, now only resolve. he warned that Saruman would not answer. The blow they had dealt with silence Orthanc might have burned beneath, but its master remained, and Saruman's mind, sharp and cunning as it ever was, would find new paths forward. The wizard had tasted failure, yes, but also a glimpse of how close he had come to reshaping the world. On the fifth morning, the riders gathered, over 500 men, assembled on the field below Edoras banners, fluttering against the pale sky, armor gleaming with polish, and eyes set northward. Theoden stood before them, mounted upon No Man, his white mane braided with golden thread, and beside him rode Eomer, clad in mail, and bearing the sword Gurthwain across his back. The host moved out just after sunrise, the thunder of hooves rolling across the hills. As they rode toward, their march was swift and relentless, a living river of strength that moved with the promise of fire. Kaelin rode near the front, just behind Wulfin, and the king's standard-bearers, Ulrich, rode farther back in the supply line, still healing from his burns, but refusing to remain. Behind, the air was cold and clear, and the grass parted easily beneath the weight of so many horses. They passed through Dunharrow, crossed the End by midday, and by the second night, the dark line of Fangorn loomed ahead. But even before they reached the tower, signs of change met them. The land around Eisenard had altered. Trees had been stripped away in greater numbers, the soil churned by machines. Where once the ground had been wild but quiet, now it was scarred with great trenches, and ringed with stakes. Smoke rose in thin spirals from vents hidden beneath the earth, and strange shapes moved in the distance, tall and angular, with gleaming sides and no faces. The host halted atop a low ridge, and Theoden called for his captains. Kaelin stood just outside their circle as the scouts delivered their report. The valley was not empty. A force awaited them, not an army of orcs or men, but something new. 50 of the sentry machines Kaelin had seen before stood guard at the base of Orthanc, arranged in a line like statues, awaiting orders. Behind them, 3 new Thormark walked in wide arcs, patrolling the ring with steady mechanical step. Their armor was darker, now their weapons larger, and their runes burned with a crimson light that flickered even in daylight. Saruman had not only rebuilt, he had improved. He has learned from our attack, Gandalf said quietly, his gaze fixed on the tower. The forge we destroyed was not the end, it was the first, and now he has refined the process. Fewer failures, fewer chains. Theoden's jaw tightened. Then we burn what remains, we bring the tower to its knees, and end this poison before it spreads further. Gandalf did not answer. He continued to study the machines with a look of calculation in his eyes, as though measuring their speed, their weight, their weakness. At last, he turned to the king. He cannot break the tower from without. May scatter his machines, yes, and perhaps even bring down some of the Thaumark, but Orthanc will not fall to siege. It is stone wrought by the hands of the West in ages past, and it will endure long after we are gone. But Saruman, he may yet be reached. Alwyn frowned. How? By truth, Gandalf said, and by the one who has already walked his shadow. All eyes turned to Kaelin. He didn't flinch. He stood straighter, the wind catching his cloak as he stepped forward. If I can get inside, I can find him. I know the paths beneath. If he's rebuilt the forge, I'll find it. And if there's a way to stop him, truly stop him, I'll take it. Alma stepped forward at once. You cannot ask him to go alone if he is captured. I won't be, Kaelin said. Not this time. Wolf Stem placed a hand on his shoulder. I'll go with him. Gandalf nodded slowly. Then go at night. Take only what you must. If you can find the root of his new forge, destroy it. But if Saruman himself stands in your path, do not fight him. Not with steel. Speak. If you can break the mirror. He looks into that night as the army made camp beneath the trees. Kaelin sat beside a small fire, checking his blade and tightening the straps on his leather armor. Wulfstan was silent beside him, sharpening his dagger. with steady, even strokes. No words passed between them. There was no need, they had both made their choice. When the moon rose, they slipped away from the camp, cloaked in black, and bearing nothing but their weapons, a coil of rope, and a small satchel of powder wrapped in waxed cloth. Kalen led the way through the gully, past the tunnel mouth he had escaped from long ago, and into the veins of the tower that had nearly broken him. But Orthanc was not as it had been. The tunnels were warmer, pulsing with hidden energy, and the air hummed with faint vibrations like distant drums. Strange lights moved along the walls, not torches, but thin streams of glowing script that flickered as they passed. The deeper they moved, the more the tower seemed to breathe, as though it had grown a mind of its own. They reached the lower forge just before dawn. What they found was not fire, but ice. The old forge chamber was gone. In its place stood a new hall, circular and vast, carved from black stone, so smooth it reflected light like water. At its center hovered a pillar of crystal, not red this time, but white and cold, suspended above a basin of silver liquid. The thormac were no longer the same. They hung from the walls like cocoons, half-formed, encased in shells of silver and iron. And around the edges of the room figures moved, not machines, but robed attendants, their faces, and behind glass masks, their hands gloved and gleaming. It was no longer a forge, it was something worse, a womb. And it was alive. The chamber shimmered with a quiet, unnatural light. The air was neither warm nor cold, but carried a stillness that pressed against the skin like deep water. Kalen stood frozen for a breath, then another, unable to take his eyes from the pillar of suspended crystal. It rotated slowly in place, casting prismatic reflections across the dark walls. And beneath it, the basin rippled, stirred by an unseen hand. He had come expecting heat and fire, the hammering of metal, and the groan of machines. But this was something different, something worse. Beside him, Wolfstan exhaled the sound barely audible above the quiet hum that filled the room. What is this place? Kalen stepped forward, eyes scanning the suspended forms that lined the walls. They were shaped like men, but their bodies were half-formed, smooth, and jointed in ways that looked more like sculpture than armor. Their faces were blank plates of polished steel, and from their backs sprouted thin silver filaments that hung like hair made of wire. They did not move, yet something about them gave the impression that they were listening, waiting, perhaps even dreaming. I think he's changed his methods, Kalen whispered. This isn't alchemy anymore, it's something else. They moved carefully along the edge of the chamber, ducking behind stone pillars and silent workstations, where the robed attendants drifted like ghosts. None of them spoke. Their movements were precise and unhurried, each attending to a different task, adjusting dials, measuring liquids, scribing notes into books with gleaming quills. Kalen could not tell whether they were men or machines, or something caught in between their masks, reflected no emotion, no soul. Only the pale light of the chamber at the far end of the hall. A wide staircase led up to a raised platform. Kalen motioned for Wolfstone to follow, and they climbed carefully, keeping to the edges to avoid the sound of their boots. From the top, they could see the full layout of the forge, or womb, as it now felt more fitting to call it. The basin of silver liquid was not a pool, but a living mechanism. Beneath, the surface shapes stirred, spindly, incomplete forms, drifting in the fluid like bones in a glassy tomb. Tubes extended from the walls into the basin's edges, pulsing faintly with light as they fed the processor. Then Kalen sought a figure at the far end of the platform, standing alone in the shadow. Saruman. He had changed. His robes were still white, but they no longer shone with the faint glimmers of color they once had. Now they were marked with fine silver runes stitched into the hem and cuffs in patterns that flickered as he moved. His staff was taller, crowned not with a crystal, but with a black ring that turned slowly in place, suspended above the wood. By unseen force his hair hung down in silver threads, and his eyes burned with cold brilliance. He did not look surprised to see them. "You have returned," he said, his voice as smooth and controlled as ever. "I wondered if the fire had given you a taste of courage or simply curiosity." Kalen stepped forward, hand near his sword, but not yet drawing it. "The forge is gone. We destroyed it." Saruman inclined his head. "You destroyed the shell, not the idea." Wolf Stan moved beside Kalen, his jaw clenched. "And now you make them here, without fire, without soul." A faint smile touched Saruman's lips. "You misunderstand, Captain. I do not make them at all. They make themselves, guided. Yes, but free from the limits of flesh. No blood, no hunger, no failure." Kalen took another step forward, eyes locked on the gleaming basin below your building. "A race, not an army. That's what this is." Saruman's smile faded. "I am correcting the world. Flesh falters, thought wavers, steel endures. The thou were only the beginning. You forced me to see that. You showed me the weakness in what I had created. This," he gestured to the chamber, "is the solution. There's nothing alive here." Walston said, "only cold things pretending to be men." Saruman turned to him, and for the first time something like anger flickered in his voice. "Men, you speak of men who age, who die, who forget everything they ever were. I have watched kingdoms rise and crumble. I have seen elves fade, dwarves retreat to their holes, men devour one another in the name of fleeting kings. What will stand when all else falls? This will." Kalen's voice was calm but firm. "You speak of endurance, but you forget choice. Well, without soul is only imitation." The silence that followed was heavy, as if the chamber itself were listening. Then Saruman stepped forward, his staff striking the floor with a hollow chime. "You have seen what I am building. You know what is coming. And still you resist." His eyes narrowed, bright and cold. "Then you leave me no choice." The hum in the walls grew louder, the basin shimmered, and the suspended figures along the wall began to stir. Their arms twitched, their heads turned. Wolf drew his sword in one smooth motion. "We need to move." Kalen reached for the satchel at his side. "We didn't come here to talk." Saruman raised his staff, but before he could strike, Kalen hurled the satchel toward the basin. It hit the floor with a thud and burst open, scattering black powder across the silver surface. In the same motion, Wolf Stan flung a spark stone, and the powder ignited in a sudden bloom of light. The explosion was smaller than the one in the old forge, but no less effective. The basin cracked, spilling silver liquid across the floor. In a wave, one of the suspended forms collapsed, its frame convulsing violently. The attendant screamed. No longer silent machines, but men, or something close to them, voices breaking through layers of control. As they stumbled and fell, Saruman recoiled, covering his face with his sleeve. Colin grabbed Wolf Stan and dove down the platform steps. Just as the first of the thou broke free from its cradle, it lunged blindly, its form unstable, limbs flickering between flesh and steel. The process had not finished. It collapsed in a heap, but others were stirring. They ran, smoke filling the air behind them as the wound chamber began to tremble. Pipes burst along the wall, spraying silver mist, and the hum turned into a high-pitched wail. The tower was rejecting the damage, resisting it, but not fast enough. They reached the lower tunnel, half blind from the smoke, and crawled through the shaft as the chamber behind them erupted in shrieks and fire. Kalen could hear Saruman shouting, though he could not make out the words. Then the stone groaned, and part of the floor collapsed behind them. They did not stop until they reached the tunnel mouth beneath. The heavy dawn was breaking again, and the plains beyond were filled with riders. The sky above Orthanc was streaked with black smoke. They emerged, coughing, eyes watering. But alive, Theoden rode forward to meet them, flanked by Emer and Gandalf. Cullen stumbled into the open, covered in ash and blood, and gave a single nod. "The new forge is broken, the womb is dying. Gandalf looked toward the tower, where smoke still rose. Then perhaps, he said quietly, there is still time. Smoke that rose from Orthanc was not like the smoke of campfires or battlefields. It was thick and slow, a heavy gray that curled upward in reluctant spirals, as though the tower itself were exhaling. The forge beneath had not simply been damaged, it had been ruptured from its foundation. And now the strange silver liquid that had filled the basin was spilling into unseen channels below, seeping into cracks in the stone, eating away at the hidden arteries that fed Saruman's machines. The air around the tower shimmered faintly, and though the great stone walls of Orthanc still stood unbroken, something in their silence had changed. Gandalf stood with Callan and Wulfstand at the edge of the camp, his gray cloak still dusted with ash. Eyes fixed on the tower's peak. Theodan had ordered the riders to hold their position on the outer ridges, watching for movement. But no Thormarmak had emerged, not since dawn, not since the second forge was torn apart. From within, the valley below was quiet now, though it was a silence born not of peace, of aftermath, and yet all knew it would not last. You struck deeper than I imagined possible, Gandalf said at last, his voice low, but not without wonder. The chamber you described it was no mere laboratory. It was a vault for Saruman's last gambit. He has exhausted what the fire gave him. Now he turns to the cold. Galen said nothing at first. He felt as though he had stepped from a dream into a story one he was still struggling to understand. He could remember the sound of the basin cracking, the flicker of half-born machines writhing in silver fluid, and the look in Saruman's eyes when the chamber began to collapse. Not rage, but recognition. It was not the fury of a craftsman watching his work destroyed. It was the sorrow of someone who believed they had glimpsed the future, only to see it denied. He wasn't just trying to build soldiers, Callan said finally. He wanted to end decay, to create something that wouldn't grow old, wouldn't forget, something permanent. Permanence without purpose becomes corruption. Gandalf replied softly, even stone crumbles when it forgets why it was shaped. Wulfstan stepped forward, brushing a smear of ash from his arm. What happens now? He's still inside. We can't breach the tower, not by force. And if he builds another forge, won't Gandalf? Said, his eyes narrowing. He's poured his mind into these creations. Every spell, every design, every secret he's hoarded since he first studied the ways of Owlet. He has nothing left now but the tower and the stone. Callan turned toward him, startled. The Palantir. Gandalf nodded. It is still within Orthanc. He watches through it, speaks through it, perhaps even draws strength from it. But it is a door as well as a window, and doors, when opened too long, invite others in. Amir joined them, then sword at his side, and his expression tense. There's movement in the upper windows, nothing more, no attack, no messenger. Just watching. Theoden approached behind him, his golden helm tucked under one arm. If you will not come out, we should go in and it burn what's left. Gandalf raised a hand. No. He must choose to fall. The tower will not be taken by fire or force, and Saruman will not be slain by those who never understood his path. But if he sees what he has become, if he looks into the ruin of his own making, he may yet break. You would trust him to break himself? Fedden asked, incredulous. I do not trust him, Gandalf said, but I know him. And felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He had seen Saruman's work more closely than anyone. He had walked the halls where others feared to tread. But what Gandalf was asking now felt different. This was not a mission. It was a reckoning. That evening under a sky tree, with violet and fading gold, Callan approached the base of Orthanc. Alone the great tower loomed above him, black and silent, the stones carved with ancient runes that caught the last light of day. No sentries guarded the broken gate. voice called down from above. He passed into the tower's shadow, as one might enter a tomb. Inside, the air was cool and dry, untouched by fire or time. The lower levels were deserted save for a few scattered tools and scraps of metal, the remnants of projects abandoned or destroyed. The stairs wound upward, narrow and steep, and Kalen climbed them without pause, each step echoing into the hollow heart of the tower. He reached the highest chamber just as the last light faded from the world outside. Saruman stood at the far end of the room, framed by tall windows and the dark cloth that draped the pedestal, holding the palantir. He did not turn when Kalen entered. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his voice, when it came, was soft. "I thought it would be you." Kalen said nothing at first. He stepped forward slowly, his boots clicking on the polished stone, until he stood a few paces behind the wizard. "You were right." Saruman turned at last. His face was pale, marked by the strain of sleepless days and the weight of failure, but his eyes still burned with the fire of intellect, sharp and clear. "So they've sent you to finish what you began." "I'm not here to fight," Kalen said. "The forges are gone. The womb is gone. What you were building, it's over." Saruman stepped forward, and though his staff still hung at his side, he did not raise it. "Nothing ends so easily. You saw only a fragment of what could have been. They would have been perfect, free of hunger, fear, immune to the weakness that shatters kingdoms. But not free," Kalen replied. "You stripped away choice memory, name. You didn't make something better, you made something empty." Saruman's face twisted, a flicker of pain passing over his features. "The world is broken, boy. I tried to mend it." Kalen looked past him toward the covered stone. "Then why are you still hiding?" There was a long silence. Then, without a word, Saruman stepped aside and pulled the cloth from the palantir. The orb gleamed in the dim light, its surface deep, endless like a well without bottom. "I have seen what is coming," Saruman said, his voice hollow, now a darkness greater than any I imagined. "I will not my own, even my creations would have fallen to it in the end." Kalen stepped closer, then stand against it. "You still can. I am no longer who I was," Saruman whispered. "Then be something else," Kalen said. "But stop being this." The wizard closed his eyes for a long time, neither moved. Then Saruman lifted the cloth and covered the palantir once more. "When the riders return," he said quietly, "I will open the gates." Kalen knew that the tower had not fallen. It had cracked when dawn broke across the valley of Nan Kiranir. It spilled golden light over the wreckage of Saruman's pride. Smoke still curled from the vents beneath Orthanc, but it no longer rose in defiance. The forges had fallen silent. The machines that once stirred beneath the tower's floor stood lifeless in their cradles, empty shells, now cold as stone. No foul match marched through the ring of Eisenard, and no new centuries crept through the grass. What remained was a tower, memory, and a man who had once worn white. The gates of Eisenard opened without resistance. Riders of the Mark entered the ringed courtyard in measured formation, their swords drawn, but not raised. Kalen rode at the head beside Gandalf, and though he had spoken no word since descending from the tower, the others understood by the change in his face that something had shifted. Bayan followed on Snowman, his banner fluttering in the morning breeze, and the sound of hooves echoed against the stone walls as the company approached. The base of Orthanc. Saruman stood upon the high stair, unarmed, and alone. His white robes moved faintly in the wind, and though his posture was straight, his eyes betrayed the weight of sleepless nights. He watched them come, without speaking, neither proud nor afraid, simply present, as though he were waiting for the last page of a book to be read aloud. Theodan dismounted and stepped forward, his gaze hard. "You once sat among the wise," he said. "You were trusted, you were honored, and now you have brought darkness to our borders and poison to your own hand what remains of you." Saruman, the wizard, lifted his head, his voice steady, though quiet. "Only truth and the ruins of what I built. Gandalf stepped forward. Then his staff held lightly in one hand. You looked into the future and tried to shape it by force. You saw the wheel turning and sought to be its master. But you were wrong. There is a storm coming, Saruman said, worse than anything you can imagine. I saw it in the stone. I saw a flame without form, a will behind the eye. Gandalf's voice was gentle. We have all seen it. But we do not answer darkness with invention, we answer it with light. There was a long silence as the wind passed through the ring of stone. Saruman looked at Kaelin then, and for the first time his voice faltered. You should not have survived the forge, he said. You should have been consumed by what you saw. Kaelin met his gaze without fear. I wasn't. I remembered who I was. Something in Saruman's expression cracked. His shoulders dropped, and he turned his face slightly away. The moment passed like a shadow across water, and then he nodded once. I will leave this place. Theodan's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, but Gandalf raised a hand. He speaks truly. He has been broken in part, and that may be enough for now. You would let him walk free? Eomer asked, frowning. I would let him choose, Gandalf replied, for the first time in many years. And so Saruman, once head of the White Council, descended the steps of Orthanc, without ceremony, passed through the gate of Isengard, and vanished into the wilds of the worlds. His power broken, his purpose lost, some say. He wandered north, cloaked in gray, speaking to no one, a shadow among the ruins, others claim. He still sought dominion, crafting whispers where once he wielded flame. But to those who stood in the ring that day, he was not a master of machines or a tyrant of will. He was a man who had seen too far and fallen too deep. That evening, beneath the stars, the riders of the Mark made camp on the edge of Fangorn. The fires burned low, and the men sang old songs, not of victory, but of endurance. Kaelin sat alone for a while, watching the flames dance. The forge was gone, the machines stilled. But he knew the world would not go untouched. Saruman had only been the beginning. What he had tried to do, what he had nearly succeeded in doing, was a warning. Wolf Stan sat beside him, passing him a skin of water. You saw something in him, he said. Did it change anything? Kaelin shook his head slowly. No, but it reminded me what matters not how long we stand or how strong we build, but who we are while we do it. Gandalf approached, then settling across the fire from them, his pipe, unlit, resting between his fingers. You did what no army could, he said. You cracked a tower from within, and more importantly, you walked out of it unchanged. I don't feel unchanged, Kaelin said quietly. Good, the wizard replied. It means you still know the difference. The stars burned overhead cold and bright, and the smoke from the last forge rose no more. The world turned onward, as it always did, and somewhere far to the east, beyond the shadowed mountains, a darker eye stirred and began to look westward. But for a while longer, there was still breath in the trees, still hope in the firelight, and a story that had reached its end, though the road ahead, like all roads worth walking, remained unwritten.